My daughter was the only one who told me the truth. Everyone else either stayed quiet or chose a side. She was 17 years old, and she walked into my home office at 11 at night, sat down across from my desk, and said, "Dad, I need you to know I see what's happening." I didn't know then how much those words would carry me through everything that came after. Drop your location in the comments. I always love knowing who's listening out there. I want to tell you something before I start. I'm 63 years old. I spent 31 years building a life I believed in. I was not a perfect man. I worked too much. I missed some recitals. I forgot anniversaries more than once. But I was faithful. I was present in the ways I knew how to be. I built a home worth something real. I raised 2 children who I loved more than I knew how to say out loud. And I genuinely tried every single year of that marriage to be enough. What I didn't understand until it was far too late was that enough had already been quietly redefined without me. My wife and I met in our early 30s. She was teaching at the local community college, English composition, and I had just taken a senior position at a civil engineering firm in Columbus, Ohio. We were both practical people. We didn't fall in love dramatically. It was slow and quiet and felt solid, the way a well-poured foundation feels solid. We got married 14 months after we met. My son was born 2 years later. My daughter came along 3 years after him. For a long time, I believed we were fine. Not fireworks fine, but real fine. Sunday mornings with coffee and the paper. Vacations to the same lake in Michigan every August. Disagreements about money that got resolved. A house we bought, expanded, renovated slowly over the years until it was genuinely ours. I put that house together with my own hands on weekends. I laid the hardwood floors in the living room myself. I built the back deck. When the furnace died in January 3 years ago, I replaced it inside of 48 hours because I knew how. That house was worth $1.2 million by the time everything fell apart. I want to say that number once, and only once, because it matters to what comes later. I don't know exactly when things changed for my wife. Looking back now, I think it was somewhere around year 22 or 23. She had gone back to full-time work after my daughter started high school, and she began spending more time with colleagues I didn't know well. There were conferences on weekends. There were evenings she came home later than expected. I noticed, but I am the kind of man who does not ask questions he isn't ready to hear the answers to. That, I understand now, was its own kind of failure. The man she eventually left me for was a department chair at her college. I'll call him what he was to me, the man she chose. He was 56, recently divorced himself, and by every visible measure he was the kind of man other people found impressive. He had published academic papers. He drove a car that cost more than my first 3 cars combined. He said things at dinner parties that made people nod slowly like they were witnessing wisdom being born. My wife found all of this magnetic. I found it exhausting on the few occasions I was in the same room with him, but I never said that out loud. I just kept building the deck and fixing the furnace and going to work and coming home. She told me in October. We were sitting at the kitchen table after dinner, and my daughter had gone upstairs, and my son was away at his apartment in Cincinnati, and she folded her hands on the table the way she did when she was about to say something she had already decided, and she told me she was in love with someone else, and had been for nearly 2 years. She said she was sorry. She said she hoped we could be adults about this. She said she didn't want the house, that she would be moving in with him, and that she thought it would be cleanest if we just sold it and divided things fairly. I did not yell. I did not throw anything. I sat there for what felt like a very long time, and then I said, "All right." She seemed almost disappointed by that. What followed was 4 months of lawyers and paperwork, and the quiet dismantling of everything I had spent 3 decades constructing. She had already told my son before she told me. He was not surprised. I learned this from my daughter, who also told me that my son had known about the man my wife had chosen for almost a year. He had met him, had dinner with them, had kept the secret through my son's birthday dinner, through Thanksgiving, through Christmas, all while sitting at my table, eating the food I paid for, watching me in my own house. When I called my son and asked him directly, he said, "Dad," she was unhappy. "You weren't giving her what she needed. I wasn't going to make it worse for her by telling you." I asked him what he thought I needed. He went quiet for a moment, and then he said, "You always land on your feet. You'll be fine." That was in November. I moved into a long-term stay hotel while the house sold. It sold in 6 weeks. My wife had already moved out. The closing happened in January, on a Thursday, in a conference room that smelled like burned coffee. I drove back to the hotel by myself and sat in the parking lot for a while before I went inside. The settlement gave me enough to be free. I was not vindictive about it. I took my share. I signed where they asked me to sign, and I walked out. My daughter called me that evening. She was in her 2nd year at Ohio State by then, living in the dorms, and she had followed all of it from a distance with a kind of clear-eyed grief that made her seem older than she was. She said, "Dad, what are you going to do now?" And I said, "I didn't know yet." She said, "Whatever it is, I think you should do the thing that actually sounds good to you, not the thing that makes sense on paper." She had always been perceptive that way. I don't know where she got it. I had been thinking for a while, longer than I'd admitted to myself, about a place I'd driven through years ago on a project in western Montana, the Bitterroot Valley. I had spent 3 days out there surveying a small bridge replacement job, and I'd eaten breakfast every morning at the same diner in a town of maybe 3,000 people, and I'd driven back roads in the evenings watching the light change on the mountains. And something about it had stuck in the back of my mind for 15 years, like a note I'd meant to return to. I had never mentioned it to my wife. It had felt too private, somehow. Too much like wanting something just for myself. I bought a used truck camper, a good one, well-maintained, solid, and I rented a storage unit for the furniture I wanted to keep. And I packed what I needed into that camper, and on a Thursday in late February, I drove west. I did not call my son to say I was leaving. I did send him a text that morning that said, "I've decided to take some time and travel. I'll have my phone. I love you. I hope you're well." He responded 6 hours later with, "Okay, take care." My daughter called me before I reached Indiana. She said, "Are you actually doing it?" I said I was. She laughed, and it was the first real laugh I had heard from anyone close to me in what felt like months. She said, "Good, send me pictures." I did, every single day. I want to tell you about the drive, because it matters to understanding what happened to me on the other side of it. I drove through Indiana, flat and gray, in late winter. I drove through Chicago traffic that should have made me anxious, but didn't. I drove through Iowa with its frozen fields, and its sky so wide it felt like it was trying to say something. I drove through South Dakota and stopped at the Badlands and stood on a rock formation at dusk and felt, for the first time in years, genuinely small in a way that had nothing to do with anyone's judgment of me. It was just the world being large. I stayed there an hour longer than I'd planned. I reached the Bitterroot Valley on a Sunday. The mountains still had snow on them. The diner was still there. It had the same smell, coffee and wood smoke, and something like maple syrup that lingered in the walls. The woman who took my order that morning was around my age, maybe a few years younger, originally from Missoula. We talked for 45 minutes about the valley and what the last decade had done to it, the good parts and the difficult parts. She recommended a campsite 30 minutes south that she said got quiet in March when the snowbirds hadn't arrived yet. She was right. It was exactly that. I stayed a week, then 2. Then I found a small rental cabin on the edge of the valley through a property management company, 2 rooms, a wood stove, a front porch with a view of the Bitterroot Range that made me stand still every morning for the first several weeks. The rent was reasonable. The landlord left me alone, and I began, slowly and then all at once, to understand what my daughter had meant about doing the thing that actually sounded good to me. I fixed the cabin's front steps in the first week because they needed it and I had the tools. I started hiking again. I had hiked in my 20s and then stopped for no reason I could clearly name. I drove down to the diner most mornings and read and had coffee and sometimes talked to people and sometimes didn't. I began drawing again, something I hadn't done since college. Just pencil sketches of the landscape. Nothing ambitious, just the practice of looking carefully at something and trying to put it down on paper. I was not happy in some dramatic, recovered way. I was something quieter than that. I was present. I was myself, with no one asking me to be a smaller version of it. My son called in April. I had not spoken to him since the text I sent from my driveway in February. He called on a Saturday morning, and I was sitting on the porch with coffee, and I let it ring once before I answered. He asked how I was. I said I was fine, that I was in Montana. He seemed surprised, like he'd expected me to be somewhere more predictable. He asked what I was doing out there, and I told him I was renting a cabin and taking some time. He said that sounded kind of extreme. I said I disagreed. Then he told me the reason he had called. His mother and the man she had chosen were getting married in June. My son had been asked to be the best man. He was calling. I understood. Not to ask my permission, but to inform me, and perhaps to make sure I wasn't going to make it difficult. He said, "He's a genuinely good man, Dad. He's established. He's stable. He treats her well. I know this is hard to hear, but I think she made the right choice for herself." I let that sit in the air for a moment. Then I said, "I'm glad she found someone." And I meant it, not with warmth exactly, but with the kind of neutral honesty that comes from having already grieved the thing completely. He seemed not to know what to do with that. He said, "You're not upset?" I said I had been upset. I said that was behind me now. He was quiet for a while, and then he said, and I want to get this right, because I've thought about it many times since he said, "You know, he's accomplished things. He has a real legacy." I just think, for her, that mattered more than he paused. More than what she had. More than what she had. I sat with that phrase on my porch with the mountains in front of me and my coffee going cold in my hand, and I felt something I can only describe as the last small hope dissolving. Not hope for the marriage. That was gone. Hope that my son had ever actually seen me. That's a different kind of loss entirely. I said, "I love you. I hope the wedding is a beautiful day." And I ended the call. I want to stop here for a moment and say something I believe is true. The moment you stop explaining yourself to someone who has already decided who you are is the moment you get your life back. I had spent 31 years trying to be seen clearly by people who were looking at me through a lens I hadn't chosen. I was done with that. Not angrily, just done. The wedding was in June, which I knew only because my daughter told me. She had been invited. It was her mother. She was going, and she called me the night before and said, "I want you to know I'm not happy about any of this, but I'm going for Mom." I said that was exactly right. I said her mother was still her mother. She said, "You're being very mature about this." I laughed and said, "I've had a few months of Montana." She laughed too. She called me the evening after the wedding. I was sitting outside by the fire I'd made in the pit. I'd dug in the backyard of the cabin, and the sky was doing something extraordinary with the last light of the day. She told me it had been a formal affair, very polished, lots of people I didn't know. She said my son had given a toast that referenced her new husband's academic accomplishments at some length. She said people had applauded. She said her mother had worn ivory and looked genuinely happy. And then she said, "There was this one moment, though, at the reception. One of the older guests, I don't know who he was, maybe someone from the college, he came up to Mom and said, 'This is lovely. And your first husband, is he well?' And Mom she kind of froze, just for a second. But I saw it. I asked what her mother had said. My daughter said, she said, 'I'm sure he's fine.' But her voice was different, just for that second. I thought about that for a while after we hung up. I thought about what it means to build 31 years of something with a person, the small daily accumulations of it, the repairs and the compromises and the 1,000 unremarkable evenings, and then to have it reduced, at a party celebrating its replacement, to "I'm sure he's fine." The summer in the Bitterroot Valley was extraordinary. I want to say that plainly, without false modesty. I hiked trails I'd never been on. I drove up to Glacier in July and camped for 4 days. I made friends, not many. I'm not a man who makes friends easily, but a few real ones. A retired firefighter who fished the river every morning at 5 a.m. and let me come along sometimes without requiring conversation. A woman who ran a small hardware store in town and had grown up on a ranch 30 miles south and knew more about practical construction than most engineers I'd worked with. I fixed things. I drew things. I got up early and went to bed when I was tired and answered to no one. I was not performing recovery. I was just living. My son came to visit in late August. This surprised me. He drove up from the airport in Missoula, and I picked him up, and we drove back to the cabin mostly in silence. When he saw it, the valley, the mountains, the porch, the way the light was sitting on everything that afternoon, he got quiet in a different way than he'd been quiet in the car. He said, "This is real." I said, "Yes." He said, "I thought you'd be somewhere more temporary." I said I didn't see why. We spent 3 days together. I took him fishing. He caught nothing, which he found funny, and I showed him the trails I walked most mornings, and we had dinner at the diner 2 of the 3 evenings. On the last night, sitting on the porch with the sun going down, he said, without preamble, "I think I got some things wrong about you." I didn't say anything. He said, "I kept comparing you to a version of success that wasn't actually yours. That wasn't fair." I nodded. He said, "I'm sorry for some of what I said." I told him I appreciated that. I told him I loved him. I told him I didn't need the apology to be a larger thing than it was. I just needed us to move forward honestly. He said, "Okay." It wasn't a full clearing of everything, but it was real, and I valued it more than a dramatic reconciliation would have given me. He left the following morning. I drove him to Missoula and watched him walk into the terminal, and I thought about how different he seemed from the young man who had called me in April. Something had shifted. Maybe the place did it. Or maybe he just needed to see his father standing upright in his own life to remember that his father was a person and not a category. The call came in September, on a Tuesday. I want to be precise about this because I know it's what you've been waiting for, and I want to tell it truthfully. I was inside, sketching at the kitchen table. I had started a series of drawings of the cabin as it changed through the seasons when my phone rang with a number I recognized immediately, though I hadn't seen it in nearly 8 months. My ex-wife? I looked at it for 2 rings. Then I answered. She said, "I wasn't sure you'd pick up." I said, "I almost didn't." There was a pause, and then she said, "How are you?" I said I was well. I said I was in Montana, and I liked it. She said she'd heard from our son. Then she said, "I'm calling because I owe you something I didn't give you properly before." I waited, she said. An honest conversation. Not through lawyers, not in the form of paperwork, just actually talking to you. I said I was listening. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "You deserved more from me than you got." In the marriage and at the end of it, I handled both badly. I said I appreciated her saying that. She said, "I'm not asking for anything. This isn't me rethinking things. I'm happy. I want you to know that. But I was not honest with you for a long time. And you went through things you shouldn't have had to go through without understanding why. And that was wrong." I sat at my kitchen table in that small cabin in the Bitterroot Valley, with the mountains outside my window, and my daughter's voice from months ago in my memory. She froze, just for a second, and I felt something settle in my chest. Not victory, not vindication, something quieter, something that felt like being seen, finally, by someone who had looked away for a long time. I said, "Thank you for calling. I meant it." She asked how long I planned to stay in Montana. I said I didn't know. Maybe permanently. She seemed surprised by that. She said, "You always talked about Colorado when we were first married. I didn't know Montana was on your list." I said it wasn't on any list. I said I had just driven that way and stayed. She laughed, a short, genuine laugh, and said, "That's very like you, actually. When you make your mind up." We talked for about 20 minutes. Not about the marriage, not about what went wrong, not about her new husband or my son's role in all of it. Just about the present, about where we were. It was the most honest conversation we'd had in years, perhaps in more than a decade. When we said goodbye, I did not feel the way I expected to feel. I felt, more than anything, free. My daughter came to visit in October. She flew into Missoula on a Friday afternoon, and I picked her up, and she was wearing the same kind of expression she always had, that particular look of hers that was both amused and observant at the same time, like she was already filing things away for later. When she got into the truck, she looked at me for a moment and said, "You look different." I asked how. She said, "Like yourself." I've held on to that. Like yourself. I don't know if she understood how much that meant to me, but I suspect she did. She has always understood more than she lets on. We spent a long weekend together. I showed her the trails and the diner and the river and the hardware store owner who had become one of my closest friends in the valley. I showed her the sketches I'd been working on, a full season's worth of the cabin in pencil, the mountains in different light, the valley road in rain. She sat at the kitchen table and went through them one by one without talking. And when she finished, she looked up and said, "These are really good, Dad." I said I didn't know about that. She said, "I do." On our last evening, we sat on the porch as the light went flat and the mountains turned that particular blue-gray they become in October twilight. She asked me what I'd learned. I said that was a big question. She said she had time. I thought about it honestly, and then I said something I'll try to repeat accurately here. I learned that I had spent a very long time trying to prove my worth in a language I didn't actually speak, to an audience that had already moved on to a different show. And somewhere around Indiana on that drive west, I stopped doing that. Not because I decided to, exactly. More because the road was too long and the sky was too wide to keep carrying something that heavy. She nodded. She said, I always thought you were worth something, just so you know. I said I knew that. I said it was one of the reasons I got through. What I want to tell you, and this is the part I'd ask you to keep, wherever you're listening from, is that there isn't a dramatic moment where everything becomes okay. There's just the accumulation of mornings where you make your own coffee and watch the light on something real and choose, again, to be present for your own life. That's all it is. But it turns out that's enormous. I am still in the Bitterroot Valley. I extended the rental on the cabin through the winter, and I'm considering buying a small piece of land in the spring. The retired firefighter is teaching me to tie flies for fishing, which I am genuinely bad at but find meditative. My daughter and I talk every week. My son and I talk less, but more honestly. Some mornings, very early, before the valley fills with light, I stand on that porch and look at the Bitterroot Range, and I think about the 31 years. I don't think about them with bitterness anymore, or with regret, or with the particular ache of feeling unseen. I think about them as a foundation that turned out to be poured in the wrong place. I had to tear it up. It was expensive, and it took a long time, and my hands bled. But the ground I'm standing on now, I chose this ground. I poured this foundation myself. That, at 63, is not a small thing. I see you out there. Whatever you're carrying right now, whatever conversation you've been having with yourself in the quiet hours about whether you waited too long or gave too much or stayed when you should have left, I want you to know that the road west is always there. Sometimes you have to drive all the way to Montana to remember who you are. Sometimes the answer is that far away from where you're standing. Leave your location in the comments. I always want to know who I'm talking to. And if this story landed somewhere real for you, like subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.